Hello and welcome to the Sound ACH weekly webinar series. My name is Lindsay and I'll be your host today as we dive into this week's topic on trauma-informed care. This week's webinar is intended for all Sound ACH partners, and the purpose of this series is to provide information and resources for partners implementing transformation strategies.
People are complicated, people are not just, what you see, and they're not just like vitals, and they're not just, let me, check your breathing. It goes deeper. Like, if you go through some personal stuff, like some personal trauma, I think that it's gonna affect you medically.
How can you ask someone about their body? How can you ask somebody about their mind and not recognize their experiences in the world as they're living in that body, as they're thinking and having that mind? It really is about recognizing people as whole beings and not just body parts. To me, that's trauma-informed care.
The majority of illnesses and conditions that people are treating in primary care settings are trauma-related, especially the ones that are the real hard issues that clinicians and patients are struggling with: substance use, chronic pain, obesity, things that providers are struggling so hard to change and help with and failing and feeling really frustrated.
So if they really want to know their patients and really want to help them in this deep level, then, learn the trauma-informed care way.
One of our most beloved patients was murdered in this really terrible way by her husband. It awakened us to the fact that actually we weren't doing a very good job. We were effectively treating HIV, but when we scratched a little bit beneath the surface, we realized that 30% of our patients have PTSD, over half of our patients are depressed, 40% of our patients are using hard drugs, and then tons of women and people living with HIV across the spectrum are dying from preventable illnesses.
I think the widespread impact of trauma and toxic stress on physical health is what has been the missing link.
It's linked to poor health in later life. Heart disease, any kind of cardiovascular disease, early sexual and multiple sexual partners, early pregnancy, mental health issues. They're all related to those adverse childhood events.
I experienced patients that were behaving in ways that were really stressful: cursing, yelling, really heightened emotions at the front desk, in my office, breakdowns. We might naturally ask ourselves, what is wrong with that person? Trauma-informed care is really about saying, what happened? Why would a person behave that way? Rather than what's wrong.
We want to give people good care, but we want them to thrive. Not just be healthy, but thrive. And it's very hard to thrive in this community.
Exposure to potentially traumatic events happens across all socioeconomic backgrounds.
Many, if not all, of our patients have a history of trauma, and also so do most of our staff. And that plays a big role in how people interact with each other and how patients do or don't take care of their health.
If you're going through some personal stuff, you're not gonna wanna take your meds. You're not gonna wanna take care of your health if you're depressed, if you're going through some mental health stuff. So I think that it's all related, it's all interrelated.
I think one of the biggest frustrations that I've seen from my medical colleagues is frustration. Like, oh my gosh, I keep telling this patient the same thing over and over again. How many times are they gonna come in, not listen to what I recommend, and then have the same symptoms and then keep coming back for the same symptoms?
And in medicine, typically what doctors do is they give advice. They tell you to eat healthier, they tell you to exercise, they tell you to check your insulin. And honestly, the medical field has been doing this for decades after decades after decades.
One of the things when someone reviews your programs, we have this for some grantees, and they want to know how many people have had a hemoglobin A1C done, how many people's blood pressure is under control, how many people have had check on whether they smoke. Those things are all important, but you could look great on that and not be giving good care. So we want to know about people's lives. How has your life changed?
This is clearly working. And I can say that really confidently, based upon a number of things. First, the effectual experience for providers is dramatic. I mean, our experience as providers has changed from being overwhelmed, from having a chaotic clinic, from telling each other, the worst war stories possible as a way of coping, which is actually really just re-traumatizing. To an experience where we're feeling like we are doing the absolutely best job possible.
When I first came here, just the greeting alone, just changed my mind about going to other doctors and so on, because the way you were treated. And you could see their true concern about your welfare. I picked that right up from going up different places. So I came back again, and I came back again. And next thing I know, they told me they had a gym here. I didn't know that.
People come willingly. They're using more services, so they're understanding that their health is not just that medical service, but it's what they eat, how much you move, and the state of your soul.
People that were kind of struggling with substance use and trauma and homelessness, it's not like that has gone away, but what we've seen is people kind of having longer periods of stability, like maybe they've actually have now found decent housing and they're doing harm reduction with their substance use, or they're sober from substances for a period of time, and maybe they slip, but they get back in touch with us more quickly than they used to.
When we're viewing people more as a whole person that has had life experiences, rather than a caricature of their behavioral reactions, we start to then make another shift from being stressed out from this person to then being more empathetic. We then shift our behavior. So if I look at someone and I say something's wrong with them, then that might give me permission to behave in ways that are not helpful. And so when I say what happened, then I am now mentally thinking, how can I help this person? Is there something that I can do that can make their experience better?
Once you start communicating where you're not being dictated to, someone is actually asking you, how do you feel about this? And how do it builds that trust. It's like, wow, they actually heard me, and I see it.
The staff or the clinicians, your medical care provider, are not just interested in your HIV. It's like, okay, your T cells are this, your viral load's that. They're more interested in your life. So you're able to talk about things, I guess, that maybe led up to being at risk for HIV from your past. And the providers, they're better able to communicate, I think, with us. And it makes us feel comfortable to talk about whatever. We know we're not going to be judged for our lives.
We did not come down here and say, by the way, we're putting a health center at 11th and Parish. People wouldn't have used it. So this way they were part of the process. In our original building, they helped design it. They met with the architects. And so this was and still is a very strong community partnership.
What I've learned taking care of people with really intense trauma is a lot can happen just by understanding why people are acting the way they're acting.
This idea that trauma-informed care and becoming trauma-informed is this huge, heavy lift. In truth, if we don't provide services in a trauma-informed way, what is the heavy lift is services that are not effective. And so what trauma-informed care means does not have to be the most elaborate, detailed, research-heavy, protocol, assessment-based approach. It can start with education and then kind of move forward.
The training piece is really key, and it doesn't need to be expensive or too time-consuming. We have 3 core trainings that we have everyone go through when they start working here, and the modules can be done in 2 hours or less.
This change process is incremental, and you can begin this as an individual person in your clinic and make a meaningful difference, not only to your patients, but to you as a practitioner. It's not radical to think that our job as primary care providers and why we went into primary care in all of our different disciplines is to actually help patients heal. I mean, that's not radical at all. It's self-evident, but it's like taught out of us. And what we're doing now in this movement towards trauma-informed primary care is to teach that back in, is to help people realize that their vision for why they went into this to begin with is to help people heal and to connect with them in that process, and to heal themselves in that process, and to have joy in that process.
Man is the only animal that cries because man alone sees the difference between what is and what could be. And I think that's the hallmark of public health. We don't just look at something and say, isn't it a shame there's so much trauma? Isn't it a shame there's so much obesity? But it doesn't have to be that way. We're not going to fix it, but collectively we can work on it. So that's the quote that guides me very often. It doesn't have to be that way.
Members of this community deserves a good, healthy, happy life.
Today you'll hear from 2 of our Advancing Trauma-Informed Care sites. But first I'll go over the objectives for today's webinar, and I'll give a brief overview on a trauma-informed approach. Our hope is that by participating in today's webinar, you'll learn how 2 large health systems are implementing trauma-informed organizational practices to better support their staffs and improve the services they provide to patients and families, and that you'll come away with practical ideas on how to implement a trauma-informed approach in your own care settings and health systems. Trauma-informed care takes the patient's experience of trauma into account and changes the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Trauma-informed care helps to build both patient and staff resilience and should include both clinical and organizational components. From the security guard at the front door to the receptionists to clinicians, all staff members should be involved in trauma-informed care efforts. Through interviews with leading trauma-informed care experts across the country and our work with the Advancing Trauma-Informed Care demonstration sites, we've identified key organizational and clinical ingredients that ideally must be in place to provide trauma-informed care. I turn it over to Dr. Rahel Briggs, who will talk about strategies for addressing trauma through a health system based on experiences scaling a trauma-informed care framework across Montefiore Medical Group. Rahel, it's all yours.
I'm going to share with you today why we embarked on this journey and how we proceeded. And I'm really going to touch on 4 key elements. Number 1, the importance of leadership buy-in, and I think Ken really eloquently described that just now. Number 2, really the logistics, the how we did this with some learning collaboratives, some online learning modules, and some in-person trainings. We think it's a truism of adult learning that we learn best when we learn in multiple different venues. Some screening initiatives we did, primarily around introducing ACEs screening for those 300,000 patients, and then the development of a critical incident management team, which I will talk about as well. So the first thing I'd say in terms of the why, Montefiore and the medical group, this outpatient primary care network I'm speaking from, already had an integrated behavioral health service. We have a team of psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers, about 80 folks who exist working alongside the physicians, nurses, and care teams and provide integrated behavioral health to the families, the patients, right there within the primary care practice. And so you might say, well, you know, in the past, before we started this work with CHCS and Robert Wood Johnson, folks would say to me, well, are you guys a trauma-informed care system? Are you trauma-informed? And I find that such a funny question. Well, hard to say. Short of, you know, doing the wonderful work that Ken mentioned, the sanctuary model from Sandy Bloom, who's trauma-informed? How do you decide, yep, we're trauma-informed? Is it because you all went to one weekend retreat? Is it because you have an integrated behavioral health service which treats trauma and assesses for trauma? Or is it something more comprehensive than that? And we decided it had to be more comprehensive than that. While our behavioral health staff were trauma-informed, they were treating trauma, they were very well versed in trauma, we knew that, for example, some of our security staff, our front desk staff, our nursing, and our physicians were not as trauma-informed. We knew we had to get leadership buy-in. That means identifying champions and, very importantly, aligning with institutional goals. I would echo what Ken said, that it's not just a question of asking for champion volunteers out there in the crowd. It's a multidisciplinary discussion about where are the champions, who are the champions. Maybe there are some folks who self-nominate, but that has to be confirmed by the behavioral health service providers in their system, by their nursing management, by their physician management, by some patients. We have a patient advisory committee. And so identifying champions is critical. The second really key piece, and I can't overstate this, and I think sometimes this gets lost in these discussions, is the importance of aligning with institutional goals. And what do I mean by that? Well, I already said Montefiore has social justice in our mission, but I mean it much more concretely than that. For example, as a healthcare institution, and hopefully a lot of you identify with this, many years ago we started working toward patient-centered medical home accreditation, or PCMH. And to be a PCMH level 3 place, you had to do all sorts of things. And, you know, deep down in there was some discussion of social determinants of health, right? In addition to working on diabetes and asthma and everything else. And I seized on that social determinants of health language and really said, isn't that trauma-informed care? And while they're not a perfect overlap, there is quite a lot of overlap. And I said, if we can do this trauma-informed care work and we do it well, then we are meeting both the spirit and the real meaning behind screening for and intervening with social determinants of health. So that's just a concrete example of what I mean by that. You're always trying to look at where your institution is going, what they've put out as their 5-year plan, what are the things they want to really hit, and how can you align with that? And while it may not seem to be a perfect match at the outset, how can you make it really fit there? So I really want to emphasize that. So one of the ways that we aligned was that we already had these existing learning collaboratives. These were things that came out of our PCMH work in the years past. And it meant that 4 times a year, multidisciplinary teams from all 21 sites gathered together for a morning and early afternoon to learn together and learn from each other. And so we took advantage of that infrastructure and layered our trauma-informed care on top of it. The goals for 2016 and early 2017 that the patient-centered medical home team were focused on were about patient experience. Ding, ding, ding. It is not a long walk to get from patient experience to trauma-informed care, right? And so we used these already existing platforms to really deliver some of the main content. And what I'm going to do today, as I'm the last speaker out of the 4 of us in this series, is really try to almost take the 500, 600 of you out there on the phone and put you into these learning collaboratives. I'm going to do little mini 2-minute teaching sessions how we taught these and how we talked about this work to these tables of folks. There were hundreds of people in the room at every time, and they would really range. There would be a representative from the front desk, from nursing, from the provider, and from management. So let me, transport you now into a nondescript hotel ballroom somewhere in the Bronx and pretend that it's April 2016 and we're really introducing trauma-informed care to our system. So we let everyone know we were going to be meeting together for these 5 learning collaboratives. And after the learning collaboratives, we were going to assign an online learning module to cover what we had discussed in the in-person meeting. Again, adult learning suggests repetition is good for you. And then the behavioral health staff at each site would do in-person trainings. And they would do them sometimes in a role-specific way, so just meeting with the nurses around a topic, and sometimes for the whole practice. We told them we'd be evaluating this, and that we'd evaluate it using a standardized measure, the Burnout, Compassion, Fatigue, and Vicarious Trauma Assessment Measure. We would also be asking our patients, doing random blinded assessments of our patients, their experience of us as a trauma-informed care system. And we'd be assigning clinical vignettes to our learners, both pre and post their learning, to see if they might react any differently. So again, you're in the ballroom, and I might say to the whole group, all right, guys, what is this trauma-informed care? It's just really aiming to acknowledge how trauma affects our patients, their experiences at Montefiore, and how working with patients with trauma histories impacts our wellness as a trauma-informed care provider system. We said our ultimate goal is shifting the way we think about our patients, their experiences, and really their behavior. Our ultimate goal is that we do our job well while staying well. And our ultimate goal, like Chris said in the beginning, is to change that reactionary question we might have in our head when people behave in certain ways, that question of what's wrong with you, to a question that really nurtures empathy and asking what happened to this person. And I'll be very honest with you, we introduced some humor into these trainings. And you say, well, I don't really get it. How is trauma-informed care a humorous topic? It's not, and that's the point. It is so deep and so dark and so intense. We let folks know they might have some reactions to the things we were talking about, and they were free to get up, go get a glass of water, take a walk, and come back. And we let them know we would try to introduce some humor here and then to just lighten the mood. So we might say, just to be clear, everybody, these are questions we have in our head. You're not going to actually go around asking patients, what happened to you? We made it clear that we weren't asking them to treat trauma. That was the work of our well-trained behavioral health staff. And that really what we're trying to do is, regardless of our role, engage patients and each other from a trauma-informed care approach. To be sensitive to engage patients, to aim to minimize re-victimization, to contribute to healing, recovery, and empowerment, and to emphasizing collaboration. Okay, so that's April 2016, and everybody's sharing the same framework. Then they do the online module. Then they get in-person follow-ups at their site. And that takes us to June 2016, our second learning collaborative, where we wanted to talk about manifestations of trauma. And so we might say, all right, guys, look at these 2 images. You've got an elephant able to remain focused and balanced in a pretty challenging situation, a stressor, compared to a person having the weight of the elephant on his back in a dark, less optimistic, and overwhelming picture. But both the ball and the person seem very unlikely to be able to stand up to the weight or the load of the elephant. But it's not the weight of the load, it's how the load is experienced. And when a stressor is perceived as unmanageable, the individual is reminded of other times when things were unmanageable, and thoughts and feelings from the past are activated. So we might say in June of 2016 to all of our learners, when a patient shows up and they're 10 minutes late and you say, well, I don't know, I'm going to have to ask the doctor, I don't even know if he can see you now. You neglect to realize that that patient took 2 buses to get there and is perceiving your reaction as particularly stressful. It's reminding them of some other time when things were unmanageable. And it might give them some triggers, right? It might make them have some traumatic beliefs that I'm not safe here, people want to hurt me, if I'm in trouble, no one will help, and the world is dangerous, right? We explained what triggers are. I think this word trigger is so universally used right now, and what does it really mean? It's a belief that an individual or a system, by the way, you can have a trauma-informed system and a traumatized system, beliefs that individuals or systems developed during stressful or traumatic events, and they are brought back to mind whenever new stress is perceived as unmanageable or overwhelming. Is it actually unmanageable or overwhelming? It almost doesn't matter. It's how it is perceived. We explain that people who have experienced trauma sometimes expect bad things to happen to them. They have difficulty managing or regulating their feelings. They might have a difficult time forming or maintaining healthy relationships. And something that was very fascinating, lest we think, oh, it's just our patients who experience trauma, excuse me, you will not be surprised to know that it crossed our whole system. Some of our physicians had experienced such extraordinary traumas that hadn't been dealt with and really understood this. All right, fast forward. Now we're in the fall of 2016. We've made it to the 3rd Learning Collaborative, so they've now had 2, and they've had online modules after and in-person sessions. And we're talking about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. We say over time, all these patient experiences start to exhaust us, and we start giving, and we're pushing, and without active and effective self-care techniques, which we're going to teach you today in the fall of 2016, we start to see an emotional and physical erosion that takes place. It becomes harder to have empathy, to have hope, to have compassion. We, the helpers, are unable to refuel, to regenerate. And it's the burnout that Ken was speaking about before, plus these trauma stories of patients and the inability to effectively refuel and regenerate. That's compassion fatigue. And it's the cost of caring. We said to them, secondary trauma is caused by exposure to trauma. You didn't experience the trauma, but you learned about it. You're not in danger, but you're learning about it. You're hearing a patient's story, you're debriefing with a colleague, and you might have secondary trauma symptoms that are similar to that of patients with experience of trauma. So you might have intrusive memories, you might have somatic symptoms, sleep disturbances, irritability, and other PTSD-like symptoms just from hearing about all of these trauma stories, not actually experiencing them yourselves. And if any of you are physicians or work with physicians, you know this went down like a load of bricks, right? Physicians like to think of themselves as just seeing trauma all day long and going home and everything is great and you separate it. But we know that's not totally possible, right? We know that there is such a thing as vicarious traumatization. We said it's not just the hard stories, the hard experience. You might even look at this picture of a full waiting room and become anxious, right? And with time, that burnout, that exposure to secondary trauma, stress, and compassion fatigue adds up. It's cumulative. And we become somewhat numb to doing this work, or others feel sad, or others feel quite angry at the unfairness of the world. And a lot of us just get totally overwhelmed and look at this picture and say, ah, it's a shift in our worldview, right? And if we're doing this job well but not staying well ourselves, this becomes vicarious traumatization. So then, now we're in the winter of 2016, and we start to teach how to respond, right? And we teach them this PEARLS acronym. We didn't invent this. You guys have probably heard about this before. We really asked them to think about when patients are having a response, and we think to ourselves, I wonder what happened to this person. We're going to focus on partnership, empathy, apology, respect, legitimization, and support. We brought in some humor, again, remember, and we said, guys, don't do this if you can't do it authentically, right? You know, touch the heart, not just the ears. So you can say, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, right? That's an apology. Or you can say, I'm really sorry that happened. We're going to thoughtfully respond versus just instinctively reacting. We taught them these 3 possible ways they might react when they are faced with secondary trauma-inducing situations. This is the work of my excellent colleague, Dana Crawford. And she first talks about the avoider, right? So what does the avoider do? They withdraw. You might refer that patient elsewhere, right? Oh, we don't have the right services for you. Why don't you go somewhere else? We silence patients. We do it with our body language. We ignore what the patient has said. We change the line of questions. We might use humor, not just as a positive way, but as a way to distract ourselves from our true experiences, right? So for an example, if a patient tells me about her assault in detail, I might avoid writing the note in the chart, right? I mean, that's the note that my manager is going to come, why don't you write this note? Why don't you sign this note? I might be a little bit short with the patient and not ask a lot of follow-up questions. I might say, well, you seem fine. I don't need to see you next week, right? And that's the avoider. Or you might be the superhero in your response to trauma. Excuse me. So we're a superhero because, you know, we went into this work. We work at Montefiore in the Bronx, and we did it because there's a helper in us. But when that helper works harder than the patient is working, that's that exaggerated sense of responsibility, right? Excessive advocacy, oversharing. Maybe we're covering for our provider friend who's constantly late. They don't complete their forms, right? So we do it for them. Or that nurse who's constantly having conflicts with patients, but you cover and you rescue that nurse. That's that excessive advocacy, right? So an example, maybe a patient doesn't show up 3 times in a row, but they remind you of somebody. And so you call, you text, you mail a letter, you leave a message at the emergency contact, and you call again before you close the case, right? And finally, some people respond as the critic or moving against. It's pretty straightforward. There's anger, irritability, sarcastic remarks, over-pathologizing, right? To change in your tone of voice, your body language. Maybe it's some sort of superiority, or maybe it's pursuing treatment goals without the client's consent. So we tried to teach everybody these 3 possible ways that they might respond and help them to self-diagnose, really, what they were doing. And then finally, in our final learning collaborative, we moved into resilience, recovery, and the commitment to change, right? So we said, listen, how are we going to cope? How do we survive this work, right? And we taught them many solutions. PEARLS that I already went through. Our organization instituted a CALM line. That's an actual phone number. You can call it yourself, 718-920-CALM, see what happens. We taught deep breathing. We did it in person. We walked everybody through deep breathing. Everybody thinks they know what deep breathing is, but we actually trained them. We trained on mindfulness. We asked each clinic to create a calm space Not just a staff lounge with the TV on and people running in and out, but a place where people could go and really do some deep breathing and mindfulness. We asked them to create walking routes. If they were in a neighborhood where it might not be safe to go out in the dark, can you do a walking route within the clinic that you map it out and you show it that it's a mile long? Who's your buddy? Do you know how to use the employee assistance program? And then the critical incident management that I talked about. So really quickly, I'm going to go through our trauma-informed care screening and the SIM team. So already with our behavioral health program, we screen for depression, we screen for autism, we screen for all sorts of things. And we had, through our Healthy Steps program, been screening for ACEs. Excuse me. But it was just for our new families, and we wanted to move into screening for ACEs for everyone, even adults. We asked practices to really think, how do you can assess your readiness? And we created a readiness assessment for them to know whether they were ready to begin conducting PDSAs, that's the, quality improvement language, Plan, Do, Study, Act, to screen for ACEs. We asked them to let us know what kinds of training and support they would need to do this screening. We had a bunch of adult doctors saying to us, all right, we get it. Y'all, the pediatricians screen for ACEs, but we're screening adults for childhood ACEs, and how is that going to help? And we shared a story that Dr. Vince Felitti gave on ACEs, where he talked about a patient with a high ACEs score who started smoking to self-medicate, which increased the patient's odds of developing lung cancer, and was really seen as a coping mechanism for childhood trauma. So if the PCP, if the primary care physician, the adult medicine doc, just tries to give some anti-smoking counseling, some patches, some quit lines, some gum, some discussions, but doesn't talk about trauma, it's not very effective. And we asked those doctors, we said, raise your, think to yourself, raise your hand. Have you had patients who've smoked for years despite your repeated counseling on the risks involved? Well, someone once said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We really tried to help them understand if the roots of some of the health risk behaviors that adults in our primary care network engage in are rooted in childhood experience of trauma, and we give them the opportunity to share that with us, it gives us a fuller picture of their health and an opportunity to intervene. Really quickly, I'm going to tell you, we had one of our site managers who once said to me, Dr. Briggs, I felt so bad. This patient came in and we gave her an ACEs screening and she was just coming in for a physical and she left needing therapy. And I said, I want you to turn that around. If she just came in for a physical and she left needing treatment for some other illness, would you feel bad? Absolutely not. You uncovered what was really going on for her. So we just shared with our staff, we said sometimes this work is amazing, it's rewarding, and sometimes the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it because we're somehow immune to it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. We get drenched and it's exhausting. It's the price of walking through the rain. If you care, you're going to get wet. You're going to get some trauma on you. And that's where trauma-informed care came in to really help them manage it. So finally, we developed this critical incident management team. This is work developed by Jeffrey Mitchell at the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. It's an evidence-based practice model, and it's really been designed to help individuals exposed to work-related critical incidents, and it's been shown to prevent post-traumatic stress. After a lot of discussion, we decided that certain things, certain events would activate our SIM team, and you see them here. Our SIM team is comprised of psychologists and social workers who went through a 2-day training and then get ongoing training in order to really do this work. And they do a small group crisis management briefing. really this rest information transition service. It's like, 10 minutes, 20 minutes for food. They're diffusing, right? They're debriefing, and then they're following up a couple months later. So I just want to end by saying these are some of our lessons learned. We had to create a shared language. What are triggers? What is vicarious traumatization? We have an enormous institution, and we had very diffused reporting structures. What do I mean by that? Well, I've been at Montefiore for almost, 13 or so years. I didn't know that some of our security guards report up to our site managers, and some are outside contractors. And it was really difficult to get the ones that were outside contractors into our training, for example. The IT infrastructure was really challenging, but I think it was critical, again, to have these multiple platforms where people could learn. ACEs screening across the lifespan has been a heavy lift. I'm happy to talk about it more because I'm sure people have questions about it. We learned a lot of lessons about how to frame it. And then really just reminding ourselves of the importance of finding champions at every level. I love that Ken mentioned that one of his champions came from the housekeeping service. So with that, I just want to say, what can you do? Not even tomorrow, why wait, this afternoon? Reflect on the importance of this work, commit to the change, and find your champions, and then it follows from there.